In China's entertainment industry, male actors are allowed to be talented, hardworking, and admired. But there is one boundary they are not expected to cross. They are not supposed to choose their own lives. Ren Jialun was once the perfect example of an industry-approved star. His image was clean, his behavior cautious, and his career followed a path carefully shaped by stability and obedience. At the peak of his popularity, he made a decision that should have been ordinary. He got married and announced it quietly, without explanation or spectacle. In a system that relies on fantasy and emotional availability, that decision mattered far more than it should have. The reaction was not loud or confrontational. There was no ban, no public criticism, and no official punishment. Instead, opportunities began to fade. Roles slowed. Resources shifted. The momentum that once carried him forward weakened in ways that were never explained. Ren Jialun did not protest or expose the system. He continued working in silence, often playing characters defined by restraint, loyalty, and sacrifice, roles that reflected the position he himself now occupied. His story raises an uncomfortable question. What does honesty cost a male actor in Cbiz when honesty disrupts control? Ren Jialun's experience is not simply about marriage or career choices. It reveals how power functions quietly, reshaping futures without open conflict, and why those who seem the most well-behaved often endure the greatest invisible pressure. To understand how Ren Jialun reached this point, we must return to his beginnings and examine the image that made him valuable and vulnerable at the same time. Before Ren Jialun became a name associated with restraint and quiet sacrifice, he was simply a young man trying to find a place in an unforgiving industry. Born in 1989, his early years were not shaped by privilege or an obvious path into entertainment. He trained professionally in sports and later transitioned into music and acting, entering Cbiz without the safety net of a powerful background. This origin would quietly define his entire career trajectory. Unlike many male stars who debut through heavy promotion or carefully manufactured personas, Ren Jialun's rise was gradual. He gained attention through historical dramas, often portraying characters who were dignified, loyal, and emotionally contained. These roles resonated with audiences not because they were flashy, but because they conveyed sincerity and emotional discipline. Over time, he became known for a specific kind of masculinity, one that was calm rather than aggressive, devoted rather than dominant. This image worked perfectly within the entertainment system. Ren Jialun was marketable without being volatile. He drew viewership without inviting scandal. For producers and platforms, he was dependable. For the industry, he was manageable. His public persona remained consistent, polite in interviews, careful in speech, and notably distant from controversy. He did not cultivate mystery through rebellion, but through emotional steadiness. As his popularity grew, expectations followed. In Cbiz, male actors who reach Ren Jialun's level are rarely treated as individuals. They are treated as long-term projects. Their personal lives are quietly absorbed into branding strategies. Romantic ambiguity becomes an unspoken requirement, not written into contracts but enforced through opportunity. To remain desirable, a male actor must appear available, not just professionally but emotionally, to the audience. Ren Jialun seemed to understand this structure. For years, he played his role well. He focused on work, avoided public excess, and maintained a disciplined presence. From the outside, his career appeared smooth and stable. Yet this stability carried a condition. The system rewarded him not only for talent, but for compliance. His value rested as much on what he did not do as on what he achieved. This made him both protected and constrained. Protected from scandal, shielded from sudden collapse, but constrained by invisible boundaries that limited choice. The audience saw consistency. The industry saw control. Ren Jialun occupied a space where silence was interpreted as professionalism and personal restraint was mistaken for personal freedom. When he chose to step outside that expectation and live openly, the contrast became impossible to ignore. What followed was not a dramatic fall, but a recalibration. to understand why the industry responded the way it did, and why Ren Jialun accepted the outcome without public resistance, we must examine the moment when this carefully balanced relationship first began to fracture. The moment Ren Jialun's carefully balanced career began to shift was not marked by scandal or controversy in the traditional sense. There was no leaked recording, no public accusation, no moral failure. Instead, the triggering event was something far more unsettling in its simplicity. He chose transparency. When Ren Jialun publicly acknowledged his marriage, he did so without anticipation of damage control. He did not frame it as a strategic disclosure, nor did he attempt to preserve the illusion that male stars are expected to maintain. In an industry built on emotional projection, this single act quietly disrupted a long-standing convention. The response was immediate, though rarely visible on the surface. What should have been a neutral personal announcement was interpreted internally as a refusal to play an unwritten role. Male celebrities in Cbiz are not officially forbidden from marrying, but they are informally discouraged from revealing it too early or too plainly. Romantic ambiguity fuels fan attachment, endorsements, and long-term marketability. By removing that ambiguity on his own terms, Ren Jialun altered how he could be positioned and sold. Soon after, subtle patterns emerged. Casting opportunities that once aligned with his strengths slowed. Projects that were rumored or tentatively discussed no longer moved forward. There were no clear rejections, only delays and silence. The industry did not need to state its displeasure directly. The system operates through access. When access is adjusted, compliance is reinforced without confrontation. Ren Jialun's reaction was notably restrained. He did not address the change publicly. He did not hint at injustice or attempt to rally public sympathy. Instead, he continued to work within the narrowing framework available to him. His roles increasingly reflected a familiar theme of endurance. Characters who uphold duty at personal cost, who place loyalty above desire, and who accept loss without protest became his defining presence on screen. Behind this shift lay a deeper conflict that few openly discussed. Ren Jialun had not violated any law, contract, or public expectation in an explicit sense. Yet he had disrupted a commercial fantasy that benefits producers, platforms, and agencies alike. His choice exposed the fragile nature of a system that depends on performers suppressing autonomy to sustain profit. The more calmly he accepted the consequences, the clearer the imbalance became. This was not a dramatic collapse, but a recalibration of power. The industry did not push him out. It adjusted him downward, quietly reinforcing the boundaries he had crossed. His silence preserved stability, but it also masked the pressure behind it. To understand the full impact of this moment, we must now examine what unfolded beneath the surface, where control tightened and conflict deepened beyond public view. After the initial shift in opportunities, the deeper conflict surrounding Ren Jialun's career unfolded quietly and persistently. There was no single decision that marked a collapse. Instead, a pattern took shape, one that revealed how power operates when it does not need to announce itself. Ren Jialun remained visible enough to avoid suspicion, yet restricted enough to prevent growth. Beyond a carefully defined boundary, this balance was not accidental. Within the industry, control rarely appears as direct punishment. It appears as recalibration. For Ren Jialun, this meant being steered toward projects that were safe, predictable, and ideologically non-disruptive. Leading roles did not disappear entirely, but they lost strategic weight. Big-budget opportunities gradually favored younger or more malleable actors. The message was implicit rather than spoken. Stability would be preserved as long as expectations were respected. The conflict deepened in how he was positioned publicly. Media narratives became narrower. Interviews focused on professionalism rather than ambition. Discussions about his future were framed around reliability, not expansion. This framing limited perception. An actor repeatedly described as steady and restrained is rarely imagined as someone who should take risks or command power within the industry hierarchy. At the same time, Ren Jialun's private autonomy came into tension with his professional confinement. Marriage had symbolically returned his personal life to himself, yet it cost him leverage. Elsewhere, he could no longer be used to sustain certain forms of fan fantasy, and this reduced his strategic value. In response, the system compensated by tightening control over what remained. Career choices became less flexible. Visibility became conditional. The true climax emerged not through external conflict, but through accumulation. Each missed opportunity, each quietly redirected. Role compounded pressure without producing a single headline. This is the kind of force that is hardest to resist because it does not look like violence. It looks like order.
Ren Jialun absorbed.
This pressure without rebellion. His decision to remain silent preserved his reputation, but it also reinforced the industry's ability to regulate behavior through consequence rather than confrontation. What made this moment particularly revealing was the contrast between his on-screen and off-screen existence. His characters continued to embody loyalty, endurance, and moral clarity. Audiences admired these qualities, often without realizing that the narratives mirrored the limits imposed on the actor himself. The industry thrives when fiction reinforces reality. In Ren Jialun's case, the line between performance and expectation blurred until it became difficult to distinguish where choice ended and compliance began. This stage represents the emotional peak of the story, not because something visibly exploded, but because something essential narrowed. The cost of autonomy became measurable. Freedom did not disappear entirely, but it was redefined. He could work but not expand. He could remain respected but not dominant. He could exist but only within the parameters set after his defiance. The conflict here is not between Ren Jialun and a specific agency or individual. It is between an actor who reclaimed a private identity and a system designed to profit from limiting that identity. The restraint he showed kept the surface calm, but beneath it lay a fundamental imbalance of power. That imbalance is the true drama, one that rarely reaches headlines because it does not produce spectacle. When an industry forces silence to appear like professionalism, it wins twice. It avoids accountability and preserves control. Ren Jialun's endurance ensured his survival within the system, but it also exposed the cost of survival itself. To understand what this recalibration ultimately meant for his career and personal trajectory, we must look at what followed and how both the industry and the audience adjusted to the new version of him that emerged from this pressure. As time passed, the consequences of Ren Jialun's choice settled into a new normal. His career did not collapse, nor did it dramatically rebound. Instead, it entered a phase of controlled continuity. He continued to appear in dramas, maintained a loyal audience, and preserved a respectable standing within the industry. From the outside, there was little to criticize. Stability, after all, is often mistaken for success. Yet beneath that surface, something fundamental had shifted. Ren Jialun was no longer positioned as an expandable asset. He became contained. His presence was permitted, but no longer amplified. The industry had adjusted its expectations, and in doing so, it quietly redefined his ceiling. He was allowed to exist, but not to dominate. He was accepted, but no longer central to long-term strategic planning. This outcome reveals an uncomfortable truth about Cbiz. Punishment is rarely loud. Control does not always require confrontation. Sometimes, it simply reorders priorities. When a performer disrupts fantasy without providing replacement value, the system adapts by narrowing opportunity rather than removing access altogether. Ren Jialun's experience illustrates how autonomy carries hidden costs in an environment built on managed perception. What makes his story particularly compelling is his refusal to dramatize it himself. He did not attempt to rewrite the narrative. He did not trade dignity for sympathy. His silence preserved personal integrity, but it also allowed the system to remain unchallenged. In this way, restraint became both his shield and his limitation. The audience admired his professionalism, often without realizing what that professionalism required him to surrender. Over time, public perception adjusted. Fans grew accustomed to seeing him as steady rather than rising, dependable rather than disruptive. The industry framed this as maturity. The deeper reality was more complex. Maturity in this context meant acceptance of boundaries that were never openly negotiated. It meant understanding that survival sometimes depends on minimizing one's footprint rather than expanding it. Ren Jialun's story does not end with a clear victory or defeat. It ends with a question that lingers beyond his career. In an industry that sells individuality while enforcing conformity, how many choices are truly free? How many silences are voluntary? And how often does dignity come at the cost of influence? He remains respected, employed, and composed. But his journey exposes the quiet trade-offs that define stardom in Cbiz. The most obedient stars are not always the most protected. They are often the most carefully controlled. Ren Jialun did not lose everything by choosing honesty. He lost something more difficult to measure. He lost the freedom to grow without permission. And perhaps that is the real price the industry demands from those who dare to live like ordinary people while standing on an extraordinary stage.